So that's what really perked my interest in this as a medicine. How is that possible? And when I looked for the answer to that question, I was led into a whole system of physiology that I had barely heard about at all in medical school, but it's a system of physiology that's probably the most prominent in our body in terms of healing and maintaining balance. It's called the endocannabinoid system. It's named after cannabis. Endo just means internal, or your own cannabinoid system. So your body is always, and has always been since you were a tiny little ball of cells in the womb, been producing and responding to substances that are like those found in cannabis. At least they act the same way. Molecularly, they look different, but they have similar functions. And in our bodies right now, we have receptors to these compounds throughout our entire system, our nervous system, our gut and digestive tract, the connective tissues, muscles, fascia, fat cells, immune cells, glands, organs, testes, reproductive organs. This is one system that permeates and crosses all these different boundaries in the body, and to me is one explanation of the mind-body connection. When we see the same substances active in the brain and in the muscles and in the organs and in the reproductive organs, it's this system of communication of holism and balance. And the goal of the endocannabinoid system throughout the body is to maintain cellular homeostasis, which means balance. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain a constant or stable internal environment despite fluctuations in the external environment. And everywhere in the body that we look, this is the role of cannabinoids. This is what they're doing, helping those cells maintain balance. Sure, we got a question. It's a good question. It's similar in that it's another substance that our body makes that are similar to substances we have found in plants. It's also for the same reason that we know about endorphins. It's because we studied opium. And we know about endocannabinoids because we studied marijuana. The reason that our knowledge of this system in the body has lagged behind the rest of our knowledge of physiology is because these substances are fat soluble, and that makes for difficult laboratory technique. So it wasn't until the 60s that a scientist was even able to understand what's the active compound in marijuana, and then Raphael Mechoulam discovered THC. The laboratory technique just lagged behind. So when I was in medical school, I barely heard about the most relative physiologic system to healing. It was mentioned just a couple times, very briefly in kind of insignificant conversations. But if you look at the body of evidence now, in a report I recently wrote for a journal, I said in the last 20 years, there's been an average of 2 scientific studies published about this per day. It's crazy if you look at scientific journals how much is coming out about this, because it's a huge new frontier for pharmaceutical industries and for our understanding of human physiology and healing. It's really where the action's at. It's the groundbreaking, newest, most exciting area of human physiology. So we can talk about what that system is doing and how marijuana affects these different parts of the body as it interacts with your endocannabinoid system. So yeah, and before I go on, I'll just kind of review and make it clear. We have cannabinoid receptors all through our body, a couple different kinds that we're aware of. Our body's own endocannabinoids can stimulate those receptors. They can be stimulated by cannabinoids found in marijuana, or phytocannabinoids for plant cannabinoids, or they could be stimulated by synthetic cannabinoids produced in a laboratory. What I'm going to go over right now are some of the effects when you stimulate something globally, meaning if you were to smoke or somehow consume or administer marijuana, you would be increasing your level of cannabinoids in your blood and globally stimulating cannabinoids throughout your body, whereas your endocannabinoid system is working more locally. If in this little part of the brain, it'll release some, and here and there, and this organ and that organ. It's having more specific effects. So first of all, in the brain, the autonomic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that you don't consciously control, even though we can have influence over it. There's 2 branches, the fight or flight and the rest and digest. And these are always working to be in balance with each other and then respond to the environment. So administration of cannabis initially stimulates, meaning it actually activates the sympathetic nervous system, increases heart rate a little bit, stimulating effect on the brain, and followed by relaxation. It controls the release of neurotransmitters. And it controls that release usually by decreasing the release of neurotransmitters. Now, it's interesting, anywhere in the body you usually see these two effects of marijuana, a biphasic effect. So for example, if someone with epilepsy who's nearing the threshold of a seizure, they have too much activity in their brain, too many nerves firing, too much excitatory neurotransmitters, too much excitement. You administer marijuana and it actually calms it down because it blocks the release of excitatory neurotransmitters. If there was the opposite problem in the brain, too much inhibition, too much of a GABAergic process going on, it's called, you could administer marijuana and it will actually excite the brain. It'll bring up the level. So remember, the job of cannabinoids is to create balance. So that's why it depends on the individual's internal environment what effect the cannabinoids are going to have. You could stimulate or you could relax, depending on what's needed. It reduces and changes perception of pain. When we look at the brain, we've mapped out the areas of the brain that have the highest density of cannabinoid receptors, and we find a lot of them in this really interesting tissue called the periaqueductal gray. It's where most of the pain signals have to pass through when they come from the body to go into the brain. And so there's lots of cannabinoids there, so that makes sense that it's useful for decreasing pain because it's stopping the release of some of those neurotransmitters, but it's also modulating them and changing your perception of pain. In areas of the brain having to do with memory, the action there is the same. It's decreasing the firing of these neurons, inhibiting some release of neurotransmitters, which will, one way of looking at that is that it's slowing it down. And this is interesting. I think that when people use marijuana, they have this feeling of time or at least memory being slowed down. People become more present. It makes it easier to forget the past, forget traumas in the case of PTSD. You know, we emphasize remembering a lot in our work and in, you know, in our lives. We feel like, oh, it's great to remember when my memory's going, that's a bad thing. But really, in the case of a lot of patients, and I think in just a lot of us that are inundated with stress and work and so forth, it's actually very useful to be able to forget. And marijuana can help you do that for a short period and bring you back into the present. Also in the brain, it can relieve migraine through a couple different mechanisms of action having to do with the blood vessels themselves and the neurotransmitters. It can prevent seizure by, like I mentioned before. It decreases muscle spasms in two areas, locally at the muscles, but also in the brain, the signals that are coming out to control the muscles. It protects against neurological injury, and this is amazing, actually. If you take, scientists have taken rats and injured their brains either by mechanical trauma or by cutting off the blood supply or by giving a toxin or a poison. What happens when a nerve in the brain dies is it opens up and it releases all its neurotransmitters. And those in a certain concentration become toxic to the surrounding cells. So then the surrounding cells start to get sick and they also start to die and they release their neurotransmitters and it's a domino effect. This is what we see in stroke or head injury, and on an MRI, for example, you would see a part of the brain with this kind of ring coming out from where the initial injury was. Cannabinoids prevent that from happening, again, because they decrease the release of neurotransmitters. So this excitatory toxicity that's happening from a cell that dies is prevented. So really, I believe that in the future we're going to see acute treatments for stroke and head injury and other neurological injury be based on THC. You know, it enhances a sense of humor and well-being. I'm not sure scientifically why that is, but I think there's a lot of evidence that that's true. It can cause drowsiness, distraction, paranoia, and anxiety. The part about paranoia and anxiety I'm going to come back to because we find certain strains will be more likely to cause that than others, and I'll talk about why in a few minutes. In the eye, it lowers intraocular pressure. Because there's less pressure in the fluid of the eye, the blood vessels then dilate, so it causes red eye. It also, all over the body, we see marijuana having a drying effect on the secretion of glands. And that's true in the eye also. It can dry the glands. In the ear, it can relieve tinnitus, the ringing in the ear, by altering the threshold of the nerves that go from the ear to the brain. And it also reduces motion sickness by working on the vestibular apparatus in the ear in the same way. It's basically decreasing it when it's overstimulated, it's settling it down. In the mouth, marijuana also dries the salivary glands. It can cause dry mouth, which is often an innocent issue, but not always. Some people with dental issues and so forth, that could be exacerbated by not having the saliva present to protect the teeth. It also enhances the perception of flavors and tastes. And we see this with marijuana or with cannabinoids basically from the time we're a few days old in the mother's fetus. It's having something to do with the feeding. Basically, the implantation of this little ball of cells on the wall of the uterus, the implantation and the suckling of blood from the wall of the uterus is mediated by cannabinoids. Then the baby's born, and the baby's appetite is stimulated by cannabinoids in the mother's milk. And we find in baby rats that when we give them a drug that blocks their cannabinoid system, they actually starve themselves to death. They don't nurse, they don't have an appetite, they die. And in the adult, it still is having something to do with our hunger and our feeding, enhancing perception of taste, increasing hunger. In the upper respiratory system, it drives secretions. Of course, if you're smoking marijuana, the heat from that smoke can cause irritation to the upper respiratory tract. In the lungs, it's a bronchial dilator. It opens the airways by relaxing the muscle around the airways. And we see that all over the body, marijuana relaxes muscles, both skeletal muscles and the smooth muscles that surround the blood vessels and the airways. So it can be useful for something like asthma. Now, the smoke can be irritating for asthma, but if you were to use marijuana in a non-smokable form, that could benefit asthma. It's an expectorant, meaning that it can help get phlegm up. Again, the smoke can cause irritation, and it's unlikely to cause cancer, contrary to what most of us have been told, by some of the drug education we might have had. There's been a study, a couple, but a big one in 2006 was published. More than 1,000 people in each group, a heavy marijuana smoking group, a non-marijuana smoking group. All the other risk factors for cancer were controlled, like tobacco smoking, alcohol, age, race, all of those things. And when we looked at the data, the marijuana smokers actually had less cancers of the respiratory tract than non-marijuana users for certain types of cancer. But certainly they didn't have any more cancers. So that was nice. Now we know there's carcinogens in marijuana smoke. That's clear. If we analyze the smoke, there's definitely compounds in that smoke that cause cancer. So how is that possible? Well, the theory is that there's also, well, it's not just a theory. We know now that there's also very potent anti-cancer properties of the cannabinoids. And so, yeah, we're taking in more carcinogens, but we're also administering this anti-cancer compound that seems to be balancing that out. In the heart, after smoking, it accelerates the heart rate. It's moderately, and that's because it lowers the blood pressure. So when blood pressure goes down, in order to deliver the blood to the tissues, the heart rate has to come up. There was a news story, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, somebody had a heart attack after smoking marijuana. I believe that that was true. I think people that have sick hearts in a very sensitive way have to be careful with marijuana just because of this slight elevation of heart rate. I don't think that it's going to be a very common problem we see as marijuana becomes a more prevalent medicine.